Just before going into our next session, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the PPF team who've been working nonstop in pulling all of this together. Yesterday, we started off with some engagement with BAMP Forum folks on the future of work. We had an engagement session with them. As you know, we hosted 13 dinners last night across the city on all sorts of really fascinating issues. This morning, we're launching a breakfast at 7 a.m. talking about Indigenous innovation and highlighting some amazing and inspirational examples. Obviously, you're here at the Growth Summit all day. And tonight, of course, we have 1,500 of our closest friends coming for dinner. Tomorrow morning, we have a deep dive strategy session with our board for the full day. So I just want to thank them. They've been working tirelessly. And now we're going to talk about how Canada's old industries are new again. And I welcome back Ed Greenspon, President of PPF, to introduce the session.
All right, thank you, Julie. And we have three speakers, presenters in the session, and I'm just going to call them up one at a time. And we'll have a quick one-on-one, and then people will take their seats. So let me start with Murad Al-Katib. Murad is the president and CEO of Agri-Food and Ingredients. He's pretty much the inventor in Canada of the pulse industry of Western Canada, the lentil king, huge export industry, great business mind, great policy mind, great musical mind, great football mind, and a whole bunch of great minds.
He's following me on Twitter now, so I guess that's all the secret.
Okay, so this great mind has taken you to a kind of unusual place, just to start, which is that you are the purchaser of a 99 yards, you see that's a 99-year lease on the Port of Churchill, the rail line to Churchill. We'll talk about the nature of the partnership in a minute, but what is it that you see in a port that's been around a long time, up and down, shallow, frozen, got some things going against it? What are you saying there?
Well, with our partner Fairfax Financial and partnership with the 29 First Nations in northern Manitoba, we see the Arctic Gateway, as a very important piece of infrastructure for generations to come. I mean, the Northern Passage is going to be a reality one day, and we can't, ignore the distance from New Jersey to Shanghai is 7,400 kilometers shorter via the north. So, we think that, again, the ability to supply the northern communities, short shipping route from Churchill to Europe, and, we think, again, that this is going to be a very important gateway for natural resources from Western Canada and goods coming into North America.
So natural resources, not just agriculture.
We're going to start with exactly. I mean, right now we've got active business in the mineral sector and grain and agri. So we're starting with dry bulk commodities, $120 million investment to refurbish the railway and the port, and it's going to be something that I think that we'll be talking about for decades and decades to come.
So a lot of people are talking about Indigenous economic development, obviously, around resources and ownership and a number of projects, LNG Canada, the pipeline, but you've actually done it.
Well, we took a very different approach. I mean, 50% of the equity of the Arctic Gateway is owned by First Nations communities and the communities on the railway line. And so, that partnership is, again, just to clarify, we purchased the assets, and then Fairfax AGT, we've taken a 99-year operating agreement from the partnership. So, I think that, having community ownership, is much different than just stakeholder consultation. So, every single one of the Northern First Nations communities had an ownership right. The Kivalliq communities in Nunavut had an ownership right. The town of Churchill, Gillam, Thompson, Flin Flon, the PA had an ownership right. So, taking that type of economic participation, it's a whole new ballgame in terms of an economic model that I think is frankly the only model that is going to work as we look forward to the future.
Yeah, time for a whole new ballgame, I think.
Whole new ballgame.
Okay, why don't you,
Thank you.
Grab yourself a seat. And next up is Lorraine Mitchelmore. Lorraine is the co-founder, co-chair of Smart Prosperity, which is promoting reduction of carbon emissions, a former president of Shell Canada, a PPF fellow. Hi, welcome up here.
We've decided we're going to disrupt this thing. We don't want to stand up. We want to sit down. So,
You do, eh?
Yeah, we do.
So you're going to,
So the minister and I decided we wanted to change it.
The minister decided. He sent you as his agent.
No,
Okay.
we just said,
Okay,
no,
come,
we're
we
not
will-
standing up.
No, you can go on the end if you want. I'm good. I'm good.
It doesn't
Okay, Lorraine, you still get a one-on-one here for
One-on-one
2
is
minutes.
fine, but not standing up.
Look, 5 years ago, when the price of oil fell through the floor, people pretty much wrote off the oil sands, not necessarily politically, but high carbon, high cost environment that just wasn't going to cut it in the new competitive circumstances that did exist. So what's happened since then?
Yeah, I think that certainly it's been quite a challenge in Alberta over the last few years. I think what's at play is the dual forces, right? Which I think the last panel really talked about. How we got a rising middle class in Asia, in the world, and there's huge demand for energy, but yet we want a world that's decarbonizing, and that's the two forces, and we've seen to have them at opposite ends. But we've not talked about the other force, which is technology. And I think that that's what's happened over the last few years. Is the industry has developed technologies that actually has made us much more competitive on both a cost and a carbon side. And I think that that's an old perception, is that we were at a marginal barrel. And that perception has not gone away, but the industry, leading players in the industry, has changed. And the bottom line is basically investment, and the other panel talked about it, the investment has gone away from our industry, but it's not because we are not carbon and cost competitive in some players, certainly. It's because of our underlying system we have not set up. And the major players is something that Murad just talked about, is infrastructure. I mean, we've talked about pipelines. We do not have the infrastructure or the regulatory system that allows our players to be competitive. Investors actually want our leadership in environment, social, and governance. Canada is actually one of the best in the world in that. But we do not have the infrastructure, as in the system underneath, to allow investors to have confidence that we can deliver.
Okay, well, once we get the minister up here, we'll go back to the things that you need governed. But let me just ask, just hang 1 second. That wasn't quite an invitation yet. I'm sorry. I just want to ask one last question. Your former company, Shell, last week said that a number of industry associations in the world were in misalignment with it on climate policy, on climate pricing. So it speaks, I think, to some kind of schism. Is the industry going to be aligned itself on the importance of climate pricing and the importance of action on climate?
I think, Ed, as many players in the industry, I mean, I was part of the group that stood on the stage with Rachel Notley 4 years ago and helped design the climate policy. There's many leaders in our industry, just like, and as I said, on par with ESG, which Dawn Farrell talked about earlier, that investors want that. And we are for a climate policy. It's so important to us because the world needs more energy, but they need it decarbonized. Our last mine that was developed actually is on par with North American average GHG intensity. No one would have thought that years ago. So the industry has really taken on board technology to drive down cost and carbon. And I think the industry is on board. And I think as Canadians, we have to look at where the industry is today versus where they were decades ago. We're still living in that old perception. The industry has moved forward a long way.
Okay, we'll come back to resource of the future in a moment. But right now, the Honourable Bains, the most powerful man in Ottawa, and who I've just crossed, which is a big mistake. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. With fans wherever you go. You know, we're talking a lot about competitiveness today, and you've been busy on a number of agendas, but I think particularly an innovation agenda over the last 3.5 years in government. As you start thinking ahead to the possibility of a next term, maybe you do think about that, where does the competitiveness agenda take us? What do you have to do next? What does any government that might be in power, any minister, have to do next?
Well, we are thinking a lot about it, both in terms of the work we've done and obviously with the hopes of getting another mandate to be able to execute on the innovation and skills plan. Competitiveness, productivity, innovation have been core of many of the budgets we presented, and most recently you saw that as well in terms of some of the policies and programs that we brought forward. I think two areas that I'd highlight in terms of items that we're working on now that will definitely require multi-year efforts as we build on this innovation and skills plan is data and IP. If you look at the economic strategy tables and the work that Murad and Lorraine have done, they've done tremendous work. And if you look at all the economic strategy tables that we have, from clean resources to clean tech to advanced manufacturing to digital to agriculture, there's one common theme: data. The data, in terms of the data that's being generated in the last 2 years, 90% of the data is being generated. And the challenge is only a fraction of that data is actually being used and benefiting companies, particularly smaller and medium-sized companies. Like 0.5% of that data is actually being analyzed and used for a meaningful purpose. And so all this data is being generated, very little of that data is being used, and then you have broader concerns around privacy that are emerging with breaches that are occurring as well. So we as a government are coming forward with a data strategy. And part of that data strategy is to come forward with a data charter that will highlight key principles that will impact our policies and programs going forward. And the idea is we want Canada to be a jurisdiction where we're the Switzerland of data, where people want to come here because they trust our laws, citizens have trust in how their data is monetized, how their data in terms of portability issues, in terms of privacy issues. So there's a lot of potential there that we're going to be moving forward with as well. And the other area that we want to focus is on intellectual property. One stat that really stands out that really highlights the challenge that we have, particularly vis-a-vis the US, because when we talk about competitiveness or productivity, we always compare ourselves to our US counterparts. If you look at the S&P 500, and if you look at the intangible assets associated with the top 50 to 100 companies, 84% of their intangible assets exist on the balance sheet for their major companies. While in Canada, the TSX, only 40% of the company's valuations are based on intangible assets. So we're really behind the IP game, both with large companies and also with smaller and medium-sized businesses as well.
But one of the things that companies say here, Minister, is that, and this is reflected, I think, in the intangibles work that Sean Spear and Robert Asselin have done that we've released. They say that IP and data are not like physical assets,
right,
which are hard to move out of the country, where you can exercise some sovereignty, some policy over them more easily. And that, and so if you want to level the playing field, if you're going to invite everybody in, if you're going to give everybody access to grants to develop this IP, but then the IP leaves the country, then it doesn't do Canada the kind of good that we want to do. So what do you do about that?
So that's a great question in terms of IP. Actually, Paul Martin called me a couple of days ago, and I was a bit worried. I thought I was in trouble from what I'd done in 2004 as his parliamentary secretary. And he called specifically regarding that article that he had read, and overall the concern that governments have had, our government and previous governments, about the amounts of money we invest in academic institutions, particularly in science and research, and all the publications that occur, and all the IP that's generated, and how do we keep that IP here in Canada. So that's part of the IP strategy that we put forward, and one of the areas is an IP collective. How do we pool that IP to help Canadian companies benefit from that IP here? How to deal with bad actors and trolls that put forward demand letters that want to extract monies or take advantage of that IP in the US court system. So we put legislative changes around that as well. So we're looking at that area. The challenge is small companies, small and medium-sized companies, only 10% of them actually have an IP strategy or IP. So there's a lot of potential. And so how do we create more awareness, more understanding, as you said, the importance of IP and retaining it and seeing those benefits here as opposed to other companies taking advantage of that?
I think certainly the supercluster strategy is going to assist us in doing one thing that I think we've really had a critical failure is building scale and IP strategy, in terms of not only realizing those benefits but keeping them. I mean, we've been really great at developing IP. Then, as you say, the benefits are flowing as these small, nimble companies are being acquired. We need a Canadian scale-up strategy, and so if we don't have the large players to develop we need to cluster them together and bring them along. And so, the protein supercluster is one where, in our sector, we're going to be looking at that interaction between data and analytics, the data management, predictive analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and then how this is going to then transform into a food safe, innovative system related to protein extraction and byproduct utilization.
I want to hear a little bit more about that from both you and Lorraine in terms, the panel's called Old Industries Are New Again. And that's built around technology, making these changes. So tell me in each of your respective industries, and I know your resources for the future plan is more than the energy industry, but how is technology being used in a way that's revolutionary, that revolutionizes the industry?
Well, I think that one thing we have to do too is look at the natural resources, complement that we're doing in Western Canada and recognize the environmental sustainability of the whole rotation of energy, agriculture, and mining. And what we're doing in agriculture is zero minimum tillage technologies. New seed varieties are increasing yields. We have the lowest greenhouse gas footprint of any cropping system in the Western Canadian landscape of anywhere else in the Americas, potentially anywhere else in the world. So, that technology element is helping our production systems. But where we really need to move now is collect the data, synthesize the data, use it to predict our supply chain needs so that we can have more efficient railways, more efficient ports, and we can start to reach 33 trillion in middle-class spending in Asia by 2030. The consumer of the future, for Canadian agriculture is for refined food ingredients, manufactured food products, using innovation, IP, and technology to transform that. So, the whole game on our side is how do we create the protein highway that the first stop is in Canada, and how do we link that to the Silk Road in Asia? And that's what we're going to do in the cluster process. So that's certainly something that the government had to, be confident in, to put quite a bit of money. But I think that the more important is, in our sector, 150 million from government, 250 million of private sector money. That's the key recipe.
Yeah, I think we can have this whole conversation on technology, innovation, and IP and everything. But I think we got to have that. Technology is the key enabler. But back to the point I made, I think that in the resources of the future table, and actually all of the tables, the foundational part was that we didn't have the right system in actually allowing our players to even start. Because when you look at technology, it's enabler. And you ask about the old and the new, really the enabler is to actually reinvent the old into the new. And I think we've been talking about it all day. Our whole resource industry is so important. And one of the foundations of getting our resource industry ready to actually compete, not at continental, because that's where we've been trading north-south, versus where the market truly is going to be in the future, which is in Asia. And getting that infrastructure pivoted, and you talked about that earlier, pivoted towards Asia. We have not got the regulatory system right. We have not got a strategic infrastructure right to really get ready for a different trading route in the future. And then the ecosystem around technology, there's all kinds, AI, clean tech, advanced manufacturing, the oil sands, the tight oil, all of these, they're all manufacturing industries. They are well ready for a digital world. That we need to bring these two together, and the companies are bringing them together. It is an incredible opportunity for Canada to actually take our resources and with our ESG reputation and bring that globally.
So what do you need from Minister Bains?
I need Minister Bains to actually help us execute, because I think I listened to the last panel, and the panel was on competitiveness. That report, not integrated at all with the 6 strategy tables. We've been doing competitiveness reports. We've been talking. I think Dawn put it very well. Canadians talk, we go have a meeting, we talk, we go have a meeting. What about execution? So for me, the government now needs, we've got enough reports. We know what we've got to do. I think everybody in this room knows the key pillars of what we have to do. We need to get a competitive mindset and just go execute. And it really needs collaboration between business and government at a critical time in our competitiveness.
I want to add a couple of things. We asked the minister very clearly, to work with his colleagues on accelerated capital cost allowance for manufacturing. We got that in the budget. That was a very important, critical step for us to be incented and to be on an equal playing field with the United States in terms of attracting that investment. I mean, I am located in Regina, Saskatchewan, and I spent $100 million in North Dakota over the last 4 years. So, this move was a very big move for us in the manufacturing sector. Secondly, the 12 million or so on regulatory enhancements and, to create a streamlined regulatory system. That, I think, is, it's higher on the agenda now. We're starting to see Minister and others, championing that, but we need it foundationally through the government in terms of, this isn't about, get rid of one regulation and create another one, because the one you get rid of might be nothing, and the one you create is a massive barrier. We have a regulatory burden in this country. The OECD report showed us at 36 on the competitiveness index. And when you quantify it, it's equivalent to a 6 to 7% tariff on small and medium enterprises. This is a massive competitive disadvantage. There's a recognition. The government's been doing a lot. We need them to continue it.
Yeah, I think the main point to highlight is that competitiveness and innovation is not one policy, one program, one budget. It's going to require a multi-year sustained effort. So different reports will feed into it time to time, new ideas will emerge, but really have we taken action? And what we've demonstrated with the Innovation and Skills Plan is we're willing to take meaningful action in a range of areas. So for example, the economic strategy tables. Since the report was issued, we've had the fall economic update and the budget, and roughly 50% of the recommendations have been implemented. And Murad's highlighted the fact that we made changes to capital cost allowance, particularly in light of what Trump had done, to make sure that we have investments here in Canada. And that benefits large companies, medium and small companies that want to scale up, particularly investing in machinery and equipment. One other area that was highlighted that was worth noting was this public-private partnership that Lorraine talks about is work-integrated learning. We in the budget put forward measures where with the public sector and the private sector will create 84,000 work-integrated learning opportunities for individuals in colleges and universities as well. And what that does is to the point that Mr. Martin was making, how do we bring our academic institutions and industry closer together? And to Murad's point with regards to the superclusters, I think that's an excellent example, again, of not only IP or data benefiting the larger players, but companies that are smaller and scaling up and making investments in technology as well. Out of the 450 proponents in the superclusters, 350 were small and medium-sized businesses. And so they'll benefit from this new IP strategy and new data strategy. And I think that's what we want to see. We want to see large companies mentor and integrate with the supply chains and particularly help the smaller companies scale and grow.
Everywhere I go, I hear about regulation. And everywhere I go, I hear about infrastructure. And I hear about these as two impediments to achieving the kind of potential that I think we see in agri-food and that we see in resources as new industries. So I hear that that rail isn't used, as we were talking about before, it's not optimized. Rail is filled with oil rather than pipe being filled with oil, and therefore there's not as much room for grain and oil seeds and other things. And I hear about, this regulatory burden we're hearing that, you're speaking about now. So what's next to clear these up? This is like kind of own wounds, right?
I want to make one point before you go to the minister on that. Let's not forget, with the data strategy and the technology strategy, infrastructure doesn't just mean railways and ports and roads and bridges.
Digital infrastructure.
It means digital infrastructure.
Right.
And I think this is probably the biggest crossroads we're at in this country, is to recognize if we're going to compete with countries like the Netherlands in agriculture that have a very small land base, we cannot have a country where you can only have a technology company in agriculture in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver.
That's right.
And so, we have to tackle the rural infrastructure issue. Go
completely,
ahead.
and then we need to get it tomorrow.
Very quickly, as Murad said, it's not only about smart cities, it's about smart farms. And how do you do that? They need a digital infrastructure. So we made significant investments along with the infrastructure bank, along with funding that we've done through capital cost allowance changes, through funding through CRTC, to put forward a comprehensive broadband strategy. And it's not simply about connecting Canadians, it's providing high-speed internet connectivity so they can be prepared for 5G and the Internet of Things and connected devices, so they can then become those smart farms that enables them to compete going forward. So that infrastructure, when we talk about infrastructure, is also important. Make no mistake, rails and pipelines are important, but I would say that digital infrastructure when we talk about data and IP and making sure that our traditional industries succeed going forward is critical as well, particularly because we have this digital divide and there's social, political, and economic consequences if we don't move forward in that direction in a meaningful way.
And one of the things that we recommended and was to develop a 50-year rolling strategic infrastructure plan. And it is both digital and physical. And one of the impediments, the opportunities, I should say, if you reframe it, is reconciliation and Aboriginal growth. And one of the things I think we really need to think about, and I'm happy to see what the government did in the last budget, and you are right, the budget has been excellent at adhering to the economic strategy tables.
Was there a budget? I hadn't read about it. Okay.
Was the A12, yeah. But was broadband in remote areas. Because when you think about our resource opportunities and our infrastructure, a lot of what Murad talked about, agriculture is in remote areas. It's tied to Aboriginals, Indigenous lands. And so I think a bringing of these two together is very important. These economic strategy tables actually lay out how we can increase our standard of living. And so they are a roadmap for our competitiveness. We need to adhere to it.
Just maybe to end on that point, you did say a 50-year rolling infrastructure strategy.
Yes.
You also said with very specific milestones for the first 5 years.
Yep, for the first 5 years.
So what are the, just very, very quickly, what are the top 1 or 2 milestones that you need?
I mean, right off the bat, from the resources point of view, we need the pipeline to the West Coast. We have to get access to tidewater and pointing towards Asia to get the real access.
I think one of the key things in the first 5 years is to reserve our gateways and corridors.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize if we're looking at a 50 and 60 and 70-year plan, we're building residential neighborhoods, industrial developments around rail, not recognizing the needs and the capacity we're going to have in the future.
Yeah.
And so, one of the first things I would do is I would reserve those corridors and ensure that municipal governments, provincial governments, and national governments are collaborating. We did that in the Asia-Pacific Gateway Initiative in the year 2006 or so, David Emerson, and we actually recommended the 50-year rolling plan in the Emerson report, which has now been rekindled under the strategy tables. It's a core recommendation for this country.
Australia has done it.
They've done it.
And Dawn talked about that this morning.
Absolutely.
We have to get ahead of these guys.
Okay, so I think we have an agenda here for the next government.
Mandate 2.0,
Lisa Rate's coming up next, so whoever the next government may be, that's not for
Oh, I
us
thought
to
you were pointing
decide
in
on
my
stage.
direction. I thought you had some insight that I didn't know about. Saw some recent polling or something.
Yeah, the whole truth.
Thank you all very much for letting us understand old industries and that they are new. And as part of this intangibles economy that we've been talking about a lot today, is not only a tech phenomenon, as the competitiveness panel set up here earlier, but but tech is everywhere and in everything, and it changes the game and creates all kinds of new potential. So thank you for that and the implications for policy.
Thank you very much.